Hello everyone. In this video and in the following video, I want to give you a little bit of guidance on how to prepare your presentations and your write-ups for your projects. In this video, I'll focus on presentations. So this is a talk style guide that I've compiled over the years. I've posted a copy of this on the class web page. And this basically consists of pieces of advice that people gave me on my presentations as I was learning how to present well. So you can think about these things as you're creating your talk to help you prepare a talk that really connects with your audience. So I'm just going to go through these one at a time. And as you're making your slides, go back to this talk style guide and make sure that your slides and your presentation content tries to follow some of this advice. So let's just go through these one at a time. So the first one is probably the most important piece of advice that anybody gave me about creating a presentation, which is say something interesting every 2 minutes. And what this means is that for each part of your talk, you should know exactly what you're trying to communicate with your audience for that part of the talk. And you should be as information dense as possible. What I mean by that is that you have to know what is the interesting bit that you're communicating every 2 minutes, and you have to keep those interesting bits coming throughout your talk. That's what an audience appreciates. The second bullet here is talk for your audience. And this is connected with the first bullet in the following way, that the word interesting is really defined by who your audience is and not by you necessarily. So just to give you an example, you may have worked really hard on a project for many months, and so what you might want to communicate with the audience is how hard that project was, or the hard parts of that project. But that might not be interesting to your audience. Your audience might instead be interested in what the results were and why those results make sense. And different audiences are interested in different things. So if you're talking to an OR audience, they might be interested in the methods and your mathematical model. But if you're talking to an executive decision maker, they might not be that interested in the mathematical model, and they might be mostly interested in the insights that you've gained and the results that your analysis shows. So make sure that your presentation is focused on the audience that you are targeting. The third bullet here is to use examples in your presentation. Now, oftentimes when you've worked on a problem for a long time, a simple example of that problem might seem totally trivial to you. But remember that your audience is seeing this problem for the very first time. So from the audience's perspective, it's never really a waste of time to go through a specific example of your problem. That really helps the audience understand what it is you're trying to solve and what are the core issues in the problem that's under analysis. Next is never flash a slide. So if you're going to have some slide with some information on there, that slide has to be up long enough for your audience to be able to consume all of the information on the slide. So regardless of whether it's just a graph or whether it's a set of equations, if you're going to put those up, you have to give the audience time to really absorb everything that's on the slide. Next is use diagrams. So different people have go to different lengths in terms of this bullet. So my basic rule of thumb is that about every 2 out of 3 slides in your presentation should either be a diagram or should include a clarifying diagram. And that's because people really understand things much quicker when they see a picture as opposed to when they see a sentence or when they see an equation. So use those diagrams to really communicate both what the problem is and maybe your solution method and the results. Now what I meant by different people go to different lengths for this bullet is that some people take this bullet to the extreme and say that every slide should be a diagram. And some people even do presentations where every slide is a picture and there's no text anywhere in the presentation. Now this bullet goes very closely with the next bullet, which is almost no text. And what I mean by this is you've all been in a presentation where the presenter will put up a slide where after each bullet there's an entire paragraph of text behind the bullet. Now, the reason this is a bad idea is because as soon as that paragraph of text comes up, the audience has a choice to either continue listening to you or to stop listening to you and read the text. And either of those options is a bad option. You don't want to give the audience that choice. You want the audience's attention to always be on you and for you to communicate to them the important parts of the problem. So the way to do that is to have your slides have almost no text. And my rule of thumb is that your bullets should never wrap around to a second line. So each bullet should never be longer than a single line. And often you can reword a bullet so that it only has a key phrase in the bullet. So maybe it's only 3 or 4 words long. The next bullet really addresses operations research talks. Many people will place a large table of real numbers in the talk. So they might have something like time to execute, and then some other information about the problem instance and so forth, and it'll be a gigantic table of real numbers. Now, I suggest never doing this in a talk, because it doesn't communicate effectively with your audience. Instead of having that table of real numbers, take that table, or pieces of that table, and turn it into a chart, a graph, a bar graph, a pie chart, something. In that way, the audience can really focus on what are the key things that you're trying to have them take away from the data that you're presenting. So in particular, nobody cares that it took 17.765 seconds to solve that particular problem. But what they do care is that your algorithm on average is performing twice as fast as the other algorithm. And a graph communicates that much more effectively than a table of real numbers. Similarly, the next bullet is also very much addresses operations research talks, which is don't have long equations. And again, we've all seen talks where somebody will flash a formulation on the slide, and that formulation will have 30 constraints, and they'll spend no time explaining what any of those constraints are. And that was just wasted time in your presentation. You don't want to have any of such time in your talks. So avoid these long equations. And sometimes it's okay to show long equations, but when you do that, you have to explain to the audience what all the pieces of the equation actually mean in terms of the real-world connection or the intuition of your problem. So often, you can rewrite the equation using English expressions to make it understandable and kind of substitute between the English expressions and the equations, and that really helps your audience understand what's going on. The next bullet addresses the outlines that we often see in presentations. In general, you want your presentation to have a very clear organization, but you want to avoid having those long repeated outlines in your talk. In particular, it's really not a good idea to have the second slide of your presentation be a long outline telling your audience the details of what you're going to tell them about. The reason that's not a good idea is because your audience doesn't understand enough about the problem at that point to actually understand that outline. And so again, it leads to wasted time in your presentation. So instead of having this long outline, just organize your presentation through the words that you say as opposed to showing a particular outline. And sometimes having a little bit of organization on the slide could be useful, but I would suggest considering using just 3 bullets. Something like, first I'm going to tell you about the mathematical model, then I'll tell you about the algorithm, and finally I'll tell you about some results and insights. That's a sufficient enough organization for the audience without details of what each of those sub-bullets contains. Next is about just body language to control your audience's attention while you're speaking. So while you're speaking, point to your slides to focus the audience's attention on what part of the slide is conveying the key information at that point. So this lets your audience know how what's coming out of your mouth is connected to what is on the slide. And that's extremely useful for making sure that you're conveying the things that you want to convey. So point to your slides and control your audience's attention during your presentation. The second to last bullet is be on time. Now, I'm sure all of you have experienced this, and I'm sure you've experienced it during our class this semester, that nothing makes an audience more unhappy than a presentation that's not on time. So when I run over a little bit in class, it makes you unhappy. If we end class too early, it makes you a little bit unhappy. And a similar thing for presentations is just generally be on time. And roughly, the guide for this is that you have a 10% margin of error either way, either up or down. But you have to be within that 10% margin of error of what the audience expects the presentation to take. And the final bullet here is just the key part that makes a good presentation, which is that good presentations teach the audience something. When an audience leaves a presentation and they can say, oh wow, I really learned something from the time that I spent listening to that speaker, that really reflects very positively on you and on the presentation that you gave. So be sure that you know exactly what you want to teach your audience during the 20 or 30 minutes or maybe an hour that you're talking with them. So make sure that what you're talking about is, 1, understandable, and 2, complicated enough to teach the audience something. So think about these things as you're preparing your presentation slides, and watch the accompanying video for some similar guidelines on how to prepare operations research write-ups, and specifically some of the executive style write-ups that are required from you in the project. Thanks for listening.